On a cold March morning in Maryland, Jennifer Vasquez Sura's world shattered. Her husband, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, was taken by federal agents. The quiet of their suburban street was broken by the sudden chaos, as Kilmar was handcuffed and led away in front of his family, leaving Jennifer and their children in shock and disbelief. Within hours, Kilmar was processed for deportation and put on a plane, sent back to the country he'd once fled in fear, despite the life he had built in the United States. The removal defied a U.S. immigration judge's order granting him protection. The government dismissed this violation as an administrative error, a phrase that did little to explain the gravity of what had happened or the consequences for Kilmar and his family. For Jennifer, that phrase masked a devastating reality. Her family, built over a decade in the U.S., was suddenly torn apart. The home they had made together was now filled with uncertainty and fear as she struggled to comfort her children and keep hope alive. Kilmar's deportation was not just a personal tragedy, it ignited a constitutional showdown between the federal judiciary and the executive branch, raising urgent questions about the rule of law and the rights of immigrants in America. In El Salvador, instead of safety, Kilmar was thrown into Seco, a notorious prison for gang members. The very people he'd escaped, the conditions were harsh, and the threat to his life was immediate and real. The U.S. government's unproven claim that he was MS-13 followed him, turning a legal battle into a fight for his life. With no evidence, the stigma alone was enough to endanger him behind bars. Jennifer's desperate efforts to bring him home became a race against time. She reached out to lawyers, activists, and the media, determined to make her husband's story heard as the case grew into a national debate about due process and the limits of government power. Kilmar's story, once a private struggle, now symbolized the stakes of American justice, reminding the nation that behind every legal battle are real families, and the consequences of government action can last a lifetime. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was a 29-year-old sheet metal worker, known for his dedication and quiet determination. He spent long hours in the workshop, shaping metal into something useful, dreaming of a safer, more stable life for himself and his loved ones. Fleeing the relentless grip of gang violence in El Salvador, Kilmar made the difficult decision to leave everything behind. He journeyed north, seeking refuge in Maryland, hoping to escape the threats that haunted his every step back home. In Maryland, Kilmar found more than just safety. He built a new life. He started a family, became part of a close-knit community, and worked hard to provide for those he loved. Friends and neighbors remember him as a devoted father and a reliable friend. In 2019, after years of uncertainty, a U.S. immigration judge recognized the real danger Kilmar faced if he returned to El Salvador. The judge granted him protection under the Convention Against Torture, acknowledging the credible threats to his life. But the government saw him through a different lens. Without presenting concrete evidence, officials alleged that Kilmar was a member of the notorious MS-13 gang, a claim that would change everything for him. His lawyers and family vehemently denied the accusation, insisting on his innocence. Yet, this unproven claim transformed Kilmar from a protected refugee into a supposed national security threat, casting a shadow over his future. Despite the judge's clear order to protect him, Kilmar was abruptly deported in March 2025. Officials later called it an administrative error. But for Kilmar and his family, the consequences were devastating and irreversible. The moment he arrived in El Salvador, authorities, citing the U.S. allegations, immediately imprisoned him as a terrorist. What began as a search for safety now escalated into an international standoff, with Kilmar caught in the middle. His fate now hung in the balance, suspended between two governments, each telling a different story and refusing to back down. The diplomatic tension grew, and Kilmar's family waited anxiously for any sign of hope. Kilmar's journey from asylum seeker to alleged enemy became a high-stakes geopolitical chess match. His life, his freedom, and his legal rights were now bargaining chips in a much larger game. The conflict between the court's protection and the executive's accusations was destined to reach the highest levels of justice, the Supreme Court, where the outcome could set a precedent for countless others. The stakes were enormous, not just for one man's future but for the credibility of the American legal system itself. As the world watched, Kilmar's case became a test of justice, compassion, and the rule of law. After Kilmar's deportation, his lawyers rushed to court, accusing the government of defying a judge's order. U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes demanded the Trump administration act immediately to secure his return, issuing forceful orders. The administration resisted, arguing that the judiciary was overstepping into foreign policy and that El Salvador's refusal made compliance impossible. Judge Zinnes pressed for daily updates, suspecting the government was stalling. The standoff escalated, a judge determined to enforce the law versus an executive branch asserting its power. The government appealed, sending the case to the Supreme Court. The question was no longer just about Kilmar. It was about whether a court could compel the executive to bring someone back from abroad. The answer would define the limits of judicial power. In April 2025, the Supreme Court issued a rare unanimous decision in Kilmar's case. The justices agreed the government had acted improperly, but stopped short of fully endorsing the lower court's demand to effectuate his return. Instead, the court ordered the administration to facilitate Kilmar's return, requiring good faith efforts but not a guaranteed result. The ruling balanced judicial authority with executive power over foreign affairs, vacating the lower court's order and sending the case back for clarification. For Kilmar's family, it was a partial victory. The court affirmed the government's ongoing obligation to try to bring him back. For the administration, it preserved presidential authority and diplomacy. The decision de-escalated the crisis, but left the ultimate outcome uncertain. Justice now depended on how both branches would act next. Kilmar's case became a defining test of the separation of powers in America. The judiciary, tasked with upholding the law, clashed with an executive branch claiming broad authority over immigration and foreign policy. The administration's refusal to comply with court orders, citing diplomatic obstacles, pushed the boundaries of executive power. Legal experts warned that if the executive could sidestep judicial rulings by creating foreign policy roadblocks, the court's authority would be dangerously weakened. The Supreme Court's ruling sought a middle ground, affirming the judiciary's power to hold the government accountable, but recognizing limits in foreign affairs. The message, the government can't ignore the law, even when diplomacy is difficult. The case's outcome would shape the future balance between the branches. The stakes, nothing less than the rule of law itself. The Supreme Court's decision sparked strong reactions nationwide. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen called the deportation a threat to the rule of law, while the Trump administration claimed victory for executive authority. El Salvador's president refused to cooperate, deepening the diplomatic standoff. For Jennifer Vasquez Sura, Kilmar's wife, the legal battle was deeply personal. Her advocacy turned her into a symbol of the fight for justice. Legal scholars praised the court's careful approach but warned the crisis was only postponed. The case returned to Judge Zinnes, with the world watching for the government's next move. The administration's response would determine whether the standoff cooled or escalated into a constitutional crisis. For Kilmar's family, the wait for justice continued. Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case is about more than one man. It's a test of the rule of law in America. It's a moment that asks whether our legal system truly protects everyone, regardless of their background or status. This case challenges us to consider what kind of nation we want to be, and whether our institutions can stand strong when tested. When the government defies court orders, it threatens the foundation that protects everyone's rights. If those in power can ignore the law, then the rights of ordinary people become fragile, and the promise of equal justice is put at risk. This is why the stakes are so high, not just for Kilmar, but for every American. The Supreme Court's ruling affirmed that the judiciary's authority doesn't end at the border, and that no one, not even the president, is above the law. This decision sends a powerful message. The Constitution applies to all, and the courts are a vital safeguard against government overreach. The case now returns to the lower court, where Judge Zinnes must find a way to enforce justice without overstepping into foreign policy. The challenge is immense, balancing the need for accountability with respect for the separation of powers. The administration's compliance will reveal whether America's checks and balances can withstand the strain. How the executive branch responds will shape the future of our democracy and set a precedent for generations to come. The world is watching to see if the system holds. International observers, legal experts, and everyday citizens are paying close attention, knowing that the outcome will echo far beyond this single case. Kilmar's story is a reminder. Constitutional rights depend on respect and cooperation from all branches of government. Only when each branch fulfills its role can justice truly be served and the rights of all be protected. The outcome will speak volumes about America's commitment to justice and whether we live up to the ideals that define us as a nation.